Sometimes you've got a big slog of a combat where maybe the player's dice just aren't doing the job today. How do you handle this? Now, quick disclaimer, I learned this from running public games, so you get to learn from my failings. Also, I use some of these tricks in my kid games too to make sure everyone stays engaged and focused. First off, we'll deal with some quick stuff. Cut down. The public games that I ran were free and open to anyone and everyone. It led to, at the peak, 14 players at the table. That's too much. It made it so that in that 2-hour session, you'd end up with maybe 2 rounds of combat each. That's a slog. If you can handle it, great. I can't. Cutting down also applies to baddies. Sometimes you don't need that many bad guys against a group of 4. It can increase the intensity, but sometimes it sucks having to swing against a low AC, hitting a low HP, and realizing that you're gonna have to use your action your next turn again and again and again to 19 more weaklings. Now, of course, AoE would be great in this situation, like a Burning Hands or a Fireball would easily take care of all these, but recognize who your players are playing. If in the moment they're in the wrong place at the wrong time, adapt. Maybe your fighter, who can only take out 2 out of 20 each round of the chaff, can kill one of them and do like an intimidation or something to see how many of the remaining 20 want to stay to meet their doom. If you've got weaklings there, to create another battle objective, like defend the innocent civilians or keep the merchant building safe, then you could change it to a single skill test instead of having to roll to hit and kill all 20 weaklings. Also, don't be afraid to roll morale. Not to say that you roll a d20 to see how each individual weakling feels in the moment, but roll a d20 as a group morale check. If it dips below a certain amount, maybe a couple of them retreat. If there's a natty 1, maybe the fighter sliced that 1 so cleanly that virtually all of them decide to flee and scrounge for scraps for a living instead of becoming scraps. Now let's say reasonable party size, reasonable baddie size, but it's still a slog, and that happens. Sometimes the dice aren't rolling the way you want them to. Make the misses count. It sucks when you miss. It sucks a lot. But what can a DM do to make it suck a little bit less? Describe it. This requires a bit more work on the DM's part because 1, you got to use a little bit more breath and some more brain power to describe a satisfying miss. And 2, you really have to know your players and their character to know how to describe it so they don't feel slighted and it feels in line with that character's motivations. The way I see it is, if you've seen enough choreographed fights, say in martial arts movies, then you'd know that a sizable portion of a well-fought combat involves missing, blocking, parrying, or other hits that are otherwise nullified. But it doesn't take away from the intensity. In fact, it builds it with each step. When something simply misses, then it feels bad. It's a part of the game, of course, but if you take the extra step and describe it like how it might feel on the big screen, it feels less bad. For example, say the fighter misses with their longsword. You could describe it as a slash that focuses maybe a little bit more on power, giving up some speed and control, which allows the enemy to see it coming and lean back, narrowly avoiding this power strike. Or if the ranger misses with their bow, you could describe it as a shot aimed for lethality, straight for the head, but because of the shape of the helmet, it simply glances off the metal, whirring past the side of the guard's head. If it's an eldritch blast, you might describe it as a shot where the caster got momentarily distracted by the presence of an ally next to the enemy. The desire to hit the enemy is overridden by the character's fear of hitting an ally. And that brings us to the need to understand every player and character. The conflict of not hitting an ally as a justification might not make sense for every character. You need to understand where the character is coming from to find the proper description that feels satisfying to the player. It has to feel satisfying in order to help alleviate slog syndrome. The final element I'd like to add, and please use this very sparingly, is to have your players roll stuff for the enemies. I know, you don't want your players to cheat, but honestly, if your players are cheating, you may have bigger problems than Combat Slog to deal with. Anyhow, if someone has had less of an active role in combat, say they've been paralyzed, confused, or something, then I'm inclined to have them roll more dice when I need to do something like a saving throw for a bad guy. This also gives that player the opportunity to excitedly bust out those dice that they've been saving in dice jail. Then they get to try to roll low. If their character has already been rendered incapacitated, shouldn't be too hard. Also, let's say that something happens that requires me to roll a ton of dice. As a DM, and I get it if you don't want to give this up, but I run enough games in the course of the week that I get to roll a ton of dice all the time. So I'd happily give that up to the players if they're either the root cause of this incident, or if they're incapacitated and they haven't had the chance to roll very much. For example, I had a giant fall off a cliff, and I had to roll for 20 die 6 damage. Now I could do that, and it'd be satisfying to hold 20 die 6 in my hands, shake them around, and let them fall. But one of my players was a little bit down about not being able to do a ton in the combat because I had them charmed. So instead, I had them roll the 20 die 6 and give me the total. In a way, it felt almost like a little bit of a revenge for them upon the enemies. I hope those tricks help you a bit when it comes to slog in combat, so everyone has fun.